taking a deep dive into some fascinating source material today, exploring the history of, well, one of the most legendary names in finance, the House of Morgan.
Yeah, and we'll be looking at excerpts that cover roughly 150 years
Wow.
from the early days with George Peabody, back in the 1830s, right through to the late 1980s. So different eras, different Morgan firms, and the key figures who really shaped them.
So think of this as getting a kind of shortcut to understanding the journey of this incredibly powerful institution. We'll try to uncover some surprising details, the human stories behind all the finance.
Exactly.
What's our mission here, would you say, in this deep dive?
Well, I think it's to trace how the Morgan name, wielded influence, how they navigated these huge crises.
Right.
And how they transformed through these seismic shifts in finance and society, too.
We'll see how they went from, what, gentlemen pirates to global power brokers?
Face-down panics, political scrutiny.
And adapted, or maybe sometimes reluctantly adapted to changing times.
Definitely reluctantly sometimes.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's go back way before J.P. Morgan was the J.P. Morgan we think of. We should probably start in, 1835 London?
Yeah, 1835 London. And with a Baltimore merchant named George Peabody.
During a U.S. debt crisis, interestingly.
That's right. And it wasn't some, obscure nation defaulting. It was American states.
Really? Which ones?
Maryland, Pennsylvania, Florida, Mississippi. They got on this craze building infrastructure, railroads, canals.
All backed by state credit.
Exactly. And Peabody was there as a commissioner, basically trying to placate these really angry British bankers holding the debt.
While back home, the politicians were busy.
Pandering, yeah.
Yeah.
Playing to the hatred of foreign bankers instead of, raising taxes to actually pay the bills.
And Peabody, well, whatever his scruples, he wasn't above using a bit of influence, was he?
Not at all. He actively helped elect politicians who were pro-payment.
Ah.
And he made a fortune when those depreciated bonds eventually paid out again.
And you see the limits of his famous altruism later on, right?
You do. He explicitly excluded those states that didn't pay up Florida and Mississippi from his later philanthropies. Even generosity had its limits, it seems.
Indeed. Okay, so then there's his relationship with Junius Morgan, JP's father.
Right. Peabody brought Junius over to London in 1854. That was actually a better time for American bankers.
Wow, is that?
Well, things were boosted by the Crimean War, and also the U.S. railroad mania was really taking off.
Okay, but here's where it gets, as you said, really interesting. When Peabody retired in 1864.
Yeah, this is quite a story. He supposedly promised Junius he could use his name in his capital.
Supposedly.
But then he just reneged, pulled both, and forced Junius to buy the office lease on what the sources call onerous terms.
Ouch. Junius's grandson apparently later called it the bitterest disappointment of his life.
You can imagine. So suddenly Junius had to rename the firm J.S. Morgan & Company.
And he desperately needed capital.
Urgently needed it, yeah. But he was still very selective, very cautious in how he did business. Remember that lecture he gave his son, Pierpont?
Oh, yeah, the famous one.
Never, under any circumstances, do an action which could be called in question if known to the world. That was the guiding principle.
That caution faced a pretty big test in 1870, though, after the Prussians beat France.
It did. Bismarck was running this whole propaganda campaign against French debt, trying to scare people off.
But Junius saw an opportunity.
He did. He managed to get involved in French state financing, which was a huge coup for the newly renamed capital-starved firm.
Okay, so this really sets the stage for J. Pierpont Morgan, Junius's son.
Absolutely. Junius was always focused on pleasing the British creditors, keeping London happy.
But Pierpont, he's the one who eventually flips that whole dynamic.
Completely reverses it.
Yeah.
Makes the U.S. the creditor, essentially. Their relationship, though, was complex.
How so?
Junius was a punishing father. Really high standards. It seems to have fueled Pierpont's intense drive.
But it took a toll.
Yeah, sources mention periods of sickness, depression. Yet, at the same time, there was this real filial worship from Pierpont.
Pierpont definitely developed his own style, though. Very different.
Completely. He preferred informal deals, handshakes, chats in the clubroom, not courtrooms.
Like his father advised, life is too short for that.
Exactly. And he saw competition as, well, destructive, inefficient.
He favored large-scale combination, bringing order.
Yes. He built this reputation. Businessmen trusted him. He paid his bills on time, stuck to his word. He became the guy you called to sort things out.
An industrial arbiter, like with the Great Railroad Treaty of 1885?
That was a landmark, a masterly feat, the sources say. bringing these warring railroad barons together.
And it even earned a rare compliment from Junius.
It did. Junius admitted Pierpont handled it better than he could have. High praise indeed.
So after Junius dies, Pierpont inherits this massive estate.
And you see this new grandiosity flower, as the book puts it.
He becomes J. Pierpont Morgan, mogul pirate art patron.
Starts that incredible art collection, commissions the huge yacht, Corsair II.
The one that had to be able to turn around in the Hudson River.
That's the one. Forget the expense, just make it fit the river.
And his presence at 23 Wall Street. Formidable.
Legendary. Sitting in that glass office, like his father,
Yeah.
Lincoln Steffens described partners looking alarmed, darting in like office boys.
They called him the senior, even partners older than him.
And that stare, apparently it could just reduce people to jelly.
This is the guy Bernard Baruch called the greatest financial genius this country has ever known. So when you look back at this whole early period, what does it really tell you?
Well, I think it shows you how much individual personalities and these relationships really shaped early finance.
Before modern regulation.
Exactly. Figures like Pierpont Morgan, they didn't just work within the system, they were the system in many ways, consolidating immense power.
Through trust, reputation, sheer force of will.
Precisely. And his influence really peaked during that 1907 panic.
Right. Frederick Lewis Allen wrote, "Where there had been many principalities, there was now one kingdom, and it was Morgan's. He was the sage, the savior."
But that panic, while cementing his status, also laid bare the system's flaws.
It led Senator Aldrich to say, basically, we can't rely on one guy forever.
Exactly. We may not always have Pierpont Morgan with us. And that directly fueled the calls for a proper central bank.
Leading eventually to the Federal Reserve.
The Fed, yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears. Moving into the era between the world wars, how did the role of these private bankers change?
Well, they became almost like adjuncts of government, performing covert missions, acting as unofficial representatives.
But under supervision.
Oh yeah, close supervision from Washington or Whitehall. But to the public, they often looked like the visible face of government policy.
It's fascinating how intertwined they were. During World War I, the House of Morgan arranged, what was it, over $1.5 billion in Allied credits.
$10.5 billion. Essentially funding the Allied war effort from Wall Street.
And British officials like Lloyd George actually credited the firm with helping win the war.
They did. Famously, one lord apparently said, "The war was won within these walls," pointing at Morgan's office.
Wow. But despite that praise, there was tension underneath.
Definitely. The British sometimes felt the bank mishandled the political side of things.
Like Jack Morgan campaigning for the Republican candidate in 1916.
Exactly. When Britain desperately needed President Wilson's support, not great timing.
And in the U.S., the bank was still pretty unpopular in many circles.
Deeply unpopular.
Right.
Seen as the personification of the malign money power. That phrase keeps popping up.
Let's talk about Jack Morgan, J.P. Morgan Jr., Pierpont's son.
Right. Pierpont apparently saw him as a bit soft, passive, even sent him on hunting trips to toughen him up.
But he inherited the empire.
He did. And then there was that shooting attempt on him in 1915.
That must have been traumatic.
Hugely. A German professor shot him in his office. Jack survived, but he was deeply affected, convinced it was some kind of state-sponsored terrorism.
And he reacted strongly.
Yeah, he apparently had German and Austrian staff got rid of at his retreat in England. And the news of the shooting attempt was actually celebrated with fireworks in Vienna. Shows the tensions.
Definitely underscores the political climate. And this role as de facto ambassadors raised tricky questions about loyalty, didn't it? Especially with clients.
Absolutely. Take Tom Lamont. He was a Wilson protege, became a key partner.
And he developed a really strong relationship with Japan.
Very strong. There was a big Japanese loan in 1924 that was described as the visible face of a shift in government policy. Basically, the U.S. government giving its nod through the Morgan Bank.
And Lamont felt quite possessive of that Japanese account, didn't he?
Very proprietary.
Right.
He did political favors, like protesting the Japanese Exclusion Act here in the U.S.
Complaining about U.S. Navy maneuvers.
Right. But then you see the downside. After the Mukden incident in 1932, the event Japan used as a pretext to invade Manchuria.
What happened?
Well, Lamont had put out a press release supporting the Japanese story that an explosion caused it.
Okay.
But later, one of his assistants found out from someone on the League of Nations Commission investigating it that the Japanese story was almost certainly just propaganda.
So Lamont had backed a false narrative.
Essentially, yeah. Shows the complexities when client interests and maybe national interests get blurred.
That complexity really comes through with fascist Italy, too.
Oh, absolutely. Initially, Wall Street generally, including Morgan's, viewed Mussolini pretty benignly.
Seeing him as saving Italy from Bolshevism.
Right, sort of overlooking the black shirt terror that brought him to power. Jack Morgan even reported back being satisfied seeing Mr. Mussolini's revolution.
And Lamont's visit there in 1925, the sources paint a picture of selective filtering.
Yeah, it seems he was kind of oblivious, or chose to be, about the recent murder of the socialist leader Matteotti, the ongoing violence.
He wrote back saying Italy seemed industrious and prosperous,
And that reports of unrest were exaggerated. He even came back with an autographed photo of Mussolini.
which he displayed as prominently as one of Woodrow Wilson.
Exactly. Quite telling.
Did he ever wise up to the reality?
Well, he did get reports later about the violence, the bellicose speeches. They sometimes upset him, but he tended to reframe it all as just a public relations problem for Italy.
And he actively tried to spin the press for Mussolini.
He did. Lined up favorable editorials, tried to influence key journalists like Walter Lippmann, though Lippmann wasn't buying it.
So why would a Wilson protege become, as the sources put it, an accomplice of Mussolini?
It seems like a mix of things. A personal, maybe romantic attachment to Italy.
That proprietary feeling for the client account again.
Definitely. And that deep Morgan training. Move mountains for important clients. Plus, he loved the political game, the intrigue, and the high-stakes gambling.
And Washington wasn't exactly discouraging it either, were they?
No, Washington tacitly supported the Italian loans, hoping it would stabilize Europe. That's a crucial backdrop.
Okay, let's bring it back home. Domestically, this period saw intense scrutiny, especially after the '29 crash and during the New Deal.
Absolutely. The crash exposed vulnerabilities everywhere, even at Morgan's, although their Victorian disdain for the stock market.
Meaning they focused more on big corporate and government deals.
Right? Wholesale issues. It meant they had less to repent than many other banks. Jack Morgan himself had a stock exchange seat for decades, but reportedly never conducted a transaction.
Still, they got caught up in the money trust investigations. Pujo in 1912, then Pecora in 1933.
Those hearings were huge. Jack Morgan testified in '33, thought he was being perfectly frank.
But Pecora's investigators got access.
They got inside, sifting through Morgan records no outsider had ever seen, though amusingly, they stopped sharp at 6 p.m. each day.
Out of deference, still.
Seems so,
Yeah.
even in the midst of this takedown.
And the Glass-Steagall Act came directly out of this era,
Directly, separating commercial and investment banking.
which Morgans argued against.
They did. Said the real problems were with retail affiliates, not firms like theirs. But after the hearings, their arguments were just seen as self-serving blather.
So that forced the split into J.P. Morgan & Co., the commercial bank, and Morgan Stanley Investment.
That's the split, yeah.
And the New Deal brought broader attacks on big business generally.
Oh, yeah. FDR called businessmen Tories, said they needed a good scare.
There were fears FDR might lean too heavily on business, like Wilson was perceived to have done with Morgans during WWI.
Right. And there were actual efforts to keep the Morgan Bank out of war mobilization work this time around because of those lingering suspicions.
Even the Reconstruction Finance Corporation meant to help struggling businesses.
It was criticized by some as a welfare agency for the rich, partly due to big loans to Morgan-connected railroads.
And the Fed itself got reformed in '35, specifically to reduce Wall Street's influence.
Explicitly. There was this seemingly small provision in Glass-Steagall stopping the New York Fed from dealing directly with foreign banks.
Why was that significant?
Because it was a direct shot at the really close, secret relationship between the NY Fed head, Ben Strong, and the Bank of England's Montague Norman.
A relationship crucial to Morgan's international business.
Absolutely. So the reform shifted power away from the district banks, especially New York, towards the board in Washington. Centralized control. Diluted Wall Street's power.
As World War II approached, the isolationist movement was strong.
Very strong. And often fueled by suspicion that Britain would dupe the U.S. again, just like in WWI.
Echoing the criticism of the Morgan Bank's role back then.
Exactly. Morgan partners themselves were apparently flatly opposed to the U.S. entering the war initially.
Doubted the Allies could win.
Yeah, doubted their chances. One apparently called the Germans too many of the devils and they are too competent. Grim.
Despite that, Tom Lamont co-founded a group advocating aid to Britain.
All aid short of war.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was complicated.
And Charles Lindbergh's famous 1940 speech.
The one widely seen as anti-Semitic, he talked about powerful elements pushing for war, for profit, for foreign allies.
The language that sounded a lot like the attacks on Morgan's.
Very much echoed the Nye Committee hearings from the mid-30s that investigated WWI profits. FDR reportedly called Lindbergh a Nazi the next day.
But despite the firm's official opposition to entering the war, Jack Morgan personally supported Britain.
He did. Transferred his yacht, Corsair IV, for British war service, donated furnishings for Bundles for Britain, a mix of personal feeling and public gesture.
And amid all this global turmoil, the family dynamics were still playing out.
Yeah, Jack Morgan felt increasingly isolated, especially after his wife died.
Maintained these huge estates, massive staff, partly for solace.
Seems so. Spent lavishly, frittering away a lot of the fortune. He preferred England, apparently.
Why England?
Wasn't caricatured by the press there like he was in the U.S. King George VI supposedly called him the world's greatest gentleman. High praise again.
And then the Richard Whitney scandal hit in the late 30s. That must have shaken things up.
Huge shock. Whitney was the president of the New York Stock Exchange. Very arrogant. A Morgan partner.
And he embezzled funds.
Big time. Even from the fund for day members' families. Morgan partners actually gave him a secret loan to try and cover it up initially.
But it wasn't enough.
Nope. He was arrested, imprisoned. Front page news. Massive embarrassment for Wall Street and for the Morgan name.
But his brother, George Whitney, also a partner.
Became known as the nice, honest Whitney brother. Quite the contrast.
So when you look at this whole period, say 1914 to the 1940s, what's the big takeaway for you?
Well, it's just a masterclass, really, in how high finance operated right at the crossroads of global politics, huge domestic changes, and shifting public opinion.
They weren't just banks.
No, they were deeply embedded players, navigating wars, the Depression, intense government scrutiny. You see this constant push and pull between their private business interests.
Their role as quasi-government agents.
And this often negative public perception of their power and influence. It's a complex brew.
Okay, let's move into the post-war era. The landscape changes again dramatically.
Absolutely. In Britain, the first thing the Labour government does is nationalize the Bank of England.
Partly seen as payback against figures like Montague Norman.
Yeah, who is so tied into that pre-war Morgan network. Meanwhile, Morgan Grenfell, the London firm,
which had been kind of sleepy, the House of Lords.
Exactly. Suddenly casts off its lethargy, becomes London's most marauding firm, specializing in aggressive takeovers.
Earning the name Gentleman Pirate.
Right. And like Morgan Stanley in the U.S., they started using that prestige to kind of stretch the limits of acceptable behavior.
Which eventually leads into the Guinness scandal in the 80s.
Yep. Illegal share support schemes during a takeover, called the city's worst scandal of the century. Prime Minister Thatcher herself demanded the heads of 2 Morgan Grenfell execs. Pretty dramatic.
Meanwhile, back on Wall Street, J.P. Morgan and Company, the commercial bank side was smaller now.
Tiny compared to rivals like Chase or First National City, but they still fancy themselves Wall Street nobility.
Kept that gentlemanly mood. Free lunches, Ivy League hires.
Yeah, George Whitney, the nice, honest Whitney brother, did a lot of the hiring himself. Very traditional.
But that old gentleman banker's code was becoming obsolete, wasn't it?
Rapidly. They couldn't just sit back and wait for clients anymore.
Had to send out the young bird dogs.
Exactly. To actively scout for business, which apparently offended some old-timers.
Who thought clients would just stay forever?
Yeah, this strange notion that no existing clients would ever even dream of taking their business elsewhere. The market was changing fast. They had to chase it.
And the Morgan family itself, their direct influence was fading.
Definitely waning. Jack's sons, Junius and Harry, stayed on, mostly out of duty, it seems.
But less suited for the new banking world.
Apparently. Junius really wanted to be a marine architect. Sources say he was pitiful to watch in banking.
The colossal Morgan energies had petered out.
That's the quote. In this pleasant but somewhat ineffectual generation. Harsh, but maybe true.
Okay, then a huge structural shift happens in commercial banking. Starts with corporate deposits eroding.
Yeah, companies were getting smarter about managing their cash. But the big bang was in 1961. First National Citibank invents the negotiable CD, certificate of deposit.
How did that change things?
It was revolutionary. Banks were suddenly freed from relying on attracting stable deposits at capped rates.
They could just buy the money they needed.
Exactly. By selling these CDs, especially in the new offshore euro markets, where rules were looser, it was called managed liabilities.
So they were managing their funding sources, not just waiting for deposits.
Precisely. And it fundamentally liberated bankers from needing those close traditional relationships with companies or consumers for funding.
And that's when relationship banking really started to crumble.
That was a major turning point, yeah.
J.P. Morgan and Co. eventually merged with Guarantee Trust in 1959.
Forming Morgan Guarantee Trust. Some felt it was more like Guarantee absorbing Morgan, given the influence of Guarantee's head, Henry Alexander.
And even with mergers, the old Wall Street physical center started declining.
Yeah, banks moved headquarters midtown.
Right.
Recognizing that CEOs weren't going to troop down to them anymore, the bankers had to go to the clients. The power dynamic shifted geographically, too.
How did the relationship between the two Morgan firms, Morgan Guarantee and Morgan Stanley, evolve after the split?
It was complex. Sometimes they cooperated. Morgan Stanley famously didn't have much back-office staff early on.
They closed deals at 23 Wall using the commercial bank's setup.
Exactly. But they also competed fiercely. Morgan Guarantee created the Euroclear system in Brussels for the Euro markets.
Without including Morgan Stanley.
Nope. Described as a community of convenience where they hoarded the potential treasure for themselves.
And the fight over just using the Morgan name caused problems.
Unending friction, especially overseas. Morgan Guarantee pushed hard for a Tokyo branch, even though Morgan Stanley felt they had prior claims or relationships.
But Japan turned out well for the commercial bank.
It became a banker's paradise for lending, strangely enough,
Ugh.
because Japanese banks effectively guaranteed the loans.
But like in the Ataka failure, a big trading company went bust.
In 1975, yeah. Morgan Guarantee had an unsecured loan out to them. But Sumitomo Bank paid it back on orders from the Bank of Japan. Risk-free lending, essentially.
The trust department also changed a lot, didn't it?
Huge transformation. They used to be loss leaders, managing family money out of obligation.
But then pension funds took off.
Exactly. Managing huge corporate pension funds became big business, especially after they landed the General Motors Fund.
But that growth brought new risks, like insider trading accusations.
Right. The Texas Gulf sulfur case in 1965. A Morgan Guarantee VP, Tommy Lamont Jr., Tom Lamont's son,
Name again.
was accused of passing inside info about a big mineral discovery to another partner, who then bought stock for trust accounts before the news broke. Showed the new dangers of managing big, active portfolios.
Okay, jumping to the 80s, London has its Big Bang deregulation.
Right. And Morgan Grenfell, the London firm, actually lagged behind rivals like Warburg's in adapting.
Why?
They didn't grasp the need for massive capital for the new style of securities trading. The old British system didn't require banks to risk much capital underwriting issues.
Unlike the American bought deal model.
Where the bank buys the whole issue and takes all the market risk. Morgan Grenfell was slow to build up the capital needed for that.
But Morgan Stanley, the U.S. investment bank, embraced the changes.
Fully. Moved aggressively into trading and sales. Became a global financial conglomerate.
The culture changed. Elegance out, brashness in.
Pretty much. Had to hustle for business, encourage aggression, become ruthless if necessary. They apparently threw a defiant party after the '87 crash, celebrating being unscathed.
And this is when the term merchant banking comes back, but with a totally new meaning.
Exactly. Nothing like the old Peabody Junius mercantile financing.
In the 80s, it meant, what? Taking stakes in deals. Bridge loans.
Yes. Firms like Morgan Stanley taking equity stakes in takeovers, making huge short-term bridge loans to finance the deals, gambling their own capital.
Big fees, but big risks.
Huge risks. Like the Owens, Illinois deal. They made a $600 million bridge loan when their total capital was only $1.5 billion. Massive exposure.
How did they manage that kind of leverage?
Are we by using holding company structures to bypass some SEC capital safeguards, putting the risk in less regulated entities?
This whole leveraged buyout LBO era was seen as pretty risky, right?
Yeah, a dangerous form of leverage, a natural sequel to the merger wave, just layering on more debt.
And J.P. Morgan and Co., the commercial bank, didn't want to miss out.
No, they jumped into hostile takeovers too, late 80s. Publicly said they'd back hostile raids, even finance both sides of a fight.
That sounds like a complete turnaround from the old Morgan ethos.
The transformation seemed complete, as one source puts it. A bit like the bank-chasing fads back in 1929 before the crash.
They even advised a hostile raider in a big pharma deal.
First commercial bank to do it. Hoffman LaRoche targeting Sterling Drug. Pharmaceuticals had always been an industry with gentlemen's agreements before that. Times were changing.
And by 1989, the commercial bank literally moves out of 23 Wall Street.
Outgrew the historic shrine. Moved to a new high-tech tower at 60 Wall. Had big cost overruns, partly financed by a Japanese insurer. Another sign of the times.
And this era also marked the end of the old paternalism, workforce cuts.
Yeah, reports of cuts, less generous benefits. That coddled lifelong employment idea was long gone.
So, wrapping up this post-war period, especially the 70s and 80s, what does it show you?
It really highlights how these massive forces, deregulation, technology, globalization, just completely reshaped finance.
And the Morgan firms had to adapt or die.
Pretty much, once pillars of tradition, they had to become aggressive, take on way more risk, adapt to this faster, less personal, more transactional world.
And sometimes stumble back into scandal along the way.
Like with Guinness or Texas Gulf Sulphur. The adaptation wasn't always smooth or clean.
So we've gone from, what, London basement offices dealing with U.S. state debt?
To gleaming high-rises managing global takeovers. It's an incredible arc. The House of Morgan story really is a microcosm of how finance itself evolved.
We've seen that fundamental shift, haven't we? From relationship banking trust, personal ties.
To a world driven by transactions, massive capital pools, technology, global reach.
From being arbiters sorting out industry fights.
To being active, aggressive players in hostile deals themselves.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Despite all those huge changes, the controversies, the scandals, the complete transformation in how they did business.
The Morgan name somehow persisted. It continued to wield significant influence, even if that influence looked very different over time.
Which I guess raises a final question for you listening.
Yeah, it's this. While the specific players change, the tactics change, even the definition of merchant banking flips completely.
Are there deeper dynamics at play, things that don't change?
Like the fundamental interplay of power, the constant pursuit of capital, the underlying tension between private ambition and the public interest? Do those things remain constant in high finance, regardless of the era?
Something to think about as you look at the financial world today.